Good morning, everyone. My name is Jody King, and I'm the Assistant Director with the Alaska Apex Accelerator. And I want to welcome you to our webinar, a discussion on sole source contracts. So this is a fabulous topic. I have a lot of information to provide. And again, I encourage any of you, if you want to add comments or ask questions, please enter those in the Q&A box or click your hand, click raise your hand, and I can unmute you on my side. I also, just a quick heads up, I'm getting over a bit of a cough still, and so I'm going to have to pause a little bit more frequently between slides just to keep that going. All right, let's get started. Let me get this. All right, so this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about competition versus sole source, and we're going to do a little bit of a slog going through FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, to look at some of the general terms and discussion. And then we're going to talk about the FAR versus the revolutionary FAR overhaul. We're going to talk about agency contracting application and approval process, so kind of what the agencies have to go through. And then we're going to talk about it as an industry business development strategy. And then we're going to talk about developing an internal buying procurement strategy that you can apply for keeping your costs down, et cetera, especially as a source strategy for cost reimbursement contracts. So while I have quite a few screenshots of the FAR, I don't want to read this to you word for word. You will have these slides made available to you again right after the webinar, but I kind of want to just talk about the highlighted. And I also want to talk about where I pulled these first couple of slides. I did use chatgpt.com/Sammy, and I just simply asked, what is the definition of competition in the FAR? And it pulled up kind of a nice, concise description, and I want to share that with you today. Again, if you're using anything ChatGPT to look up related to government contracting, verify those sources and don't make the assumption that all of that is correct. All right, so it says in the context of the FAR, competition refers to the process by which the government seeks offers from multiple sources to ensure fair opportunity, reasonable pricing, and the best value for taxpayer. So then we get into the full and open competition, and the key ideas behind that is maximizing participation, supporting fairness, providing government the opportunities to select based on the best value, and the transparency. Since these solicitations, soon to be contracts, are paid for by taxpayer dollars, there is that obligation by the federal government to provide that transparency where that spending is going. And then we'll kind of talk about here in the next few slides, the FAR Part 6, which really goes over competition, elimination of sources, and then other than full and open. Click on this again. So we're going to talk about competition versus sole source, and what does the FAR say? So right from the beginning, and again, this is a great reference, this series, subpart 6.1, full and open competition. And as we can already see from the ChatGPT's generalization, the goal is to promote and provide for full and open competition. And it says here that under the policy, that contracting officers shall provide full and open competition through the use of competitive procedures. Well, why competition? It lowers prices. So we have those cost savings components, and that winds up allowing the contracting officer to develop their price justification. That's done for every award. So if we have competition, the nature of competition is going to push that cost down, again, dependent on the award evaluation, if they're basing it on cost as a primary or if they're doing a best value. But again, competition helps make people lower their prices in an effort to be more competitive. It also provides an opportunity for selection. Again, that gives that contracting officer that opportunity to select under best value. What are they trading here and there? Price, is that, first or third on that list of past performance, experience, and then process, that technical approach, so best value. And it also provides industry expertise for potential solutions. Sorry, guys, let me get my speaking going again. Okay, try that again. Industry expertise for potential solutions, which ties into that source selection. Makes sense. Competition is great. It gives everybody that opportunity. So then we kind of delve down a little further into the FAR, and they talk about full and open competition after exclusion of sources. And my brain's like, well, wait a second, if we're excluding sources, how can it be full and open? And so when we dig a little bit, it provides full and open competition after excluding one or more sources. So if we kind of delve down, they talk about, again, the required use of competitive sources. Okay, we kind of hit that a few times. So then it said agencies may exclude a particular source from a contract action in order to establish or maintain an alternative source or sources. So again, if we're looking at all of the proposals that are submitted to the agency, even though they make the award to one, unless it's a multiple award, they can look back down the road. If they go to recompete, they can look at those other proposals and it gives them the alternative sources should something change and they need to switch directions, switch contracting officers, possibly not award an option year, et cetera. So it is providing alternate sources and information interested. It increases and maintains competition. We talked about, reducing cost, and it ensures the continuous availability of reliable sources. So here again is the link for that FAR. Okay, so excluding sources, and then it talks about, and I'm not going to go over each one of these because this is a whole different webinar talking about all of the socioeconomics programs. But when they talk about excluding sources, they start talking about filtering down based on agency authority to help meet business goals, et cetera, to still maintain full and open, but they start into what they call set-asides. If they determine that it's in the government's best interest to help meet those small business goals, that they want to move from a full and open competition into some sort of set-aside. And of course, each one of these small business certifications also come with language that allows for sole source opportunities. So then we continue that discussion. Well, what do they mean other than full and open? So here we go. The authority for contracting without providing for full and open competition, and we tie into rolling down to policy. Contracting without providing for full and open shall not be justified on the basis of. So here's what they can't do. They can't say, well, we're not going to open it up to everybody because, one, a lack of advanced planning. Maybe we just don't have time. The last couple of years with delays in receiving funding, things get pushed until the last minute before those funds are released. And yes, absolutely, those contracting officers are scrambling, but that in and of itself is not a reason to avoid competition. And then concerns related to the amount of funds, say the funds will expire to the agency or activity for the acquisition of supplies or concerns. Again, we can use that example where we're running up against that fiscal year end and they're trying to get those awards out, and competition takes time. It takes time to post that solicitation, allow the industry to respond, and then to go through multiple offers to make that determination. So although that kind of becomes a reality, again, FAR says, no, these are not justifiable reasons to limit sources. So then we kind of keep going. It says, well, what happens when there's only one responsible source and no other sources or no other supplies or services will satisfy the agency requirements? And so this is kind of where we land. And here's that FAR reason for even the topic today is we're now talking about those sole sources. So here's the authority by US code, or United States code, but let's look at the highlighted. So when supplies or services required by the agency are available from only one responsible source and no other type of supplies or services will satisfy agency requirements, full and open competition need not be provided for. And so here's some of the things that we can start looking at. Supplies or services may be considered to be available from only one source if the source has submitted an unsolicited research proposal. Okay, so there's one path to that sole source concept. And it talks about these three things that an unsolicited solicitation has to have before the agency can really look at that seriously. And if you read further in the FAR on unsolicited solicitations, it's such a phrase, that's a tongue twister in of itself, but the agencies are required to look at them if they're viable and do the review as if, and look at the potential of that, what the agency is offering. But keep in mind, you have to hit all three of those salient points before it's viable for the contracting officer even to review. And then Here under II, it says supplies may be deemed to be available from only one original source in the case of a follow-on contract for the continued development and production of a major system or highly specialized equipment, including major components thereof, when it is likely that award to any other source would result in. So here's another substantial duplication, unacceptable delays. So think if we had a multi-phase program, and again, that cost of bringing in someone other than the incumbent would have additional delays, additional cost for the new team to take over. So there are justifications here. We're looking at two, unsolicited solicitations, or in the case of follow-on or continued development, where bringing in someone that is not already involved in this would have that additional duplication of cost and unacceptable delays. And then we talk about this and we're continuing down here. We keep seeing, then here's the application. So this is the guidance for the contracting officer. The authority shall be used if appropriate in preference to the authority of, so there's our call out. It shall not be used when any of the other circumstances is applicable. Use of this authority may be appropriate in situations such as the following. And again, these examples are not intended to be all-inclusive and do not constitute authority in of themselves. So here's our examples. So we're going to look at these next few. So when is the reasonable basis to conclude, when there is a reasonable basis to conclude that the agency's minimum needs can only be satisfied by unique supplies or services available from only one source or only one supplier with unique capabilities, or, and then we have some language for DoD, but I'm going to jump past it, the existence of limited rights data, patented rights, copyrights, or secret processes, so company proprietary data, the control of basic raw material or similar circumstances make the supplies and services available only from one source. And then number 3 here, when requiring utility services, okay, that kind of makes sense. Circumstances may dictate that only one supplier can furnish the service. So we see that quite a bit up here in Alaska when there's just only one provider for utility services. When the agency head, so number 4, when the agency head has determined in accordance with the agency's standardization program that only a specified makes and models of technical equipment and parts will satisfy the agency's need for additional units or replacements items, and only one source is available. So this is a little bit more common than what we realize. Say, for example, and I'm going to use our university for our IT purchases within the University of Alaska, which is the host organization for our program. We have, of course, the Apple products, but when it's anything other than Apple products, they use exclusively Dell products. The university has a very specific contract with Dell. All of the clients, the IT support, the technical support, the folks that maintain the hardware, that do the repairs, maintain the IT system, all of that is Dell. They're trained for Dell. They know Dell back and forth. They have those certifications from Dell. And so therefore, that makes sense if we're using this example, even though this is federal, but for our university, because we have a standardization program. So if you think about that, say for JBear example, and they're moving towards having facility monitoring systems, such as fire support or any of the mechanical, some of those that are digitized monitoring systems, and they might have those standardized from building to building because, again, their personnel are trained to watch and work within those systems. And if they have multiple different systems, there's a multiple different training programs. So with that in mind, that is a huge cost savings, and that makes sense. The other thing that falls under this standardization, say we have heavy equipment that we've purchased and might have a very long warranty on that, and the warranty would be voided should we use someone that was not certified to maintain that equipment. And in that case, there might only be one vendor that can provide that maintenance and reselling of parts of equipment for that particular mechanic, for that particular heavy equipment, because that's part of the manufacturer allowance to have a longer warranty. So I kind of talked a circle, but you get the idea. There are times where having that sole source for these various reasons really does make sense for that buying activity. So let's talk a little bit about application for brand name descriptions, because we do see this commonly for, especially for supply, where we'll see that FAR clause, brand name or equal. So we might have where there's that desire for that requisition or that contracting officer's client, that end user, the government employment, that program, where they have a preference for a brand name, but maybe it doesn't fall within one of these, not a standardization. And we start to talk about desire versus need. So here the FAR is saying an acquisition or a portion of an acquisition that uses a brand name description or other purchase description to specify a particular brand name. So now we're talking about those salient characteristics of that technical benchmarks that have to be met. Product or feature of a product particular to one manufacturer does not provide for full and open competition, regardless of the number of sources solicited, and shall be justified and approved in accordance with. And I have an example of that justification here further down the road here. So, okay, so brand name or equivalent. So we'll might see the FAR clause added again, brand name or equivalent, and what they're talking about is those salient characteristics. We know brand A does A, B, C, and if you have alternate options, they have to meet those same technical components. Often those solicitations will have kind of a pass-fail for the technical to make sure that you are meeting that same usability of that product. Okay, so let's hop down here. So brand or name or equal other purchase descriptions that permit prospective contractors to offer end products other than those specifically referenced by brand name provide for full and open competition and do not require justifications. So if we are doing a justification, or I'm sorry, if we are doing this as a sole source procurement using that brand name specific, unless it fits into an agency standardization program, keep in mind that the contracting officer has to then go through a justification and approval process as to why they restricted that down to that brand name. And so here the FAR is saying this is not the only, this is not acceptable. Again, that preference versus need to make that a sole source activity. Now I'm kind of bringing this up and taking the time to look at it from the FAR perspective, because later in our presentation, when we get into, sole source as a business development avenue, we're going to talk about thinking about what the contracting officer has to go through to develop a sole source award and have it go through, and that justification process that they have to provide to support why they awarded that sole source contract. And if we as businesses understand that when we're marketing and developing, we're better prepared. And we'll talk more in just a second. All right, let me move on. So again, we have other reasons for sole source: unusual, compelling urgency, industrial mobilization, engineering development, R&D, international agreements, authorized or required by statute. And I'm going to kind of break down, I got a couple examples here. So this is what we here called the first sourcing, the required sourcing. So Unicorn, the federal prison industries that have the furniture, they provide the furniture programs, and the qualified nonprofit agencies for the blind or severely disabled, which is called Ability One programs, and we see that used heavily when it comes to, say, janitorial, especially here in the state of Alaska. We have several nonprofit businesses that have Ability One certified programs, and they have those sole source opportunities for janitorial contract. And then, of course, the government printing and binding. So what if we're looking at, having these required sources, but they don't meet our need for whatever reason, and then that justification as to why we are moving away from that. And we'll look at that in just a moment. And then of course, there's the sole source opportunity under those small business programs. And here's the language that calls it out for the 8A, HUBZone, veterans, and the women-owned small business programs. The others I'm just kind of provided for your information, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Of course, for concerns of national security and concerns for public interest, again, these are all justifications under why an agency can make a determination to do a sole source award. Now, so we kind of did a long slide through the FAR, and thank you for hanging in through all of that. But now we're going to kind of flip it over on its head because we've got these FAR clauses. But in addition, we also have that revolutionary FAR overhaul that has renumbered, redefined, and slimmed it down, removed the language down to basic statute. And I haven't taken the time to show you this. We don't need to go through it a second time, but I did compare and look through all the FAR clauses that we just discussed and compared them against that revolutionary FAR overhaul. And while the numbering system is just different, the language is pretty much still there. I haven't seen anything that was severely changed from that original FAR language. I just want to call that to your attention that currently, until these two systems merge and all of those changes made under the RFO are incorporated fully into the FAR, there are those two different resources that contracting officers are having to weigh against each other. And in addition to, there's the practitioner albums, which means each agency has their own additional provisions, guidance, and policies that they're going to implement to substantiate or further define the FAR clauses under the RFO. So keep that in mind. Right now, contracting officers are still looking at both that FAR language and the RFO language to compare. And you can see the titles have pretty much stayed the same, and although the numbering system has changed, that information is still there. All right, I just wanted to give that for you. You know, if you have a spare 10 minutes, have more of the FAR to read. All right, so let's talk about federal contracting staff application and approval. So let's take a peek behind the screens of what the contracting officers have to do to make a sole source a viable and acceptable option. So now we're talking about agency guidance and that process leading into a sole source. So each agency will have a different internal process for issuing a sole source award. And I bring this up because my experience with sole source is when I was I was a contractor that had a position as a contract specialist at FAA. So I had a supervisory contractor that reviewed and signed for all of the work I did, but I was in the contracting field for a while at FAA. And during that time, I worked on 2 different sole source applications. And so whenever I think about that process and that, what do the contracting officers have to go through that we as industry may not be aware of, here's kind of how it flowed for me. So that general flow from purchase requisition to award. 1, the contracting officer, and I'm just going to use that military abbreviation, the KO, receives a PR, purchase requisition, with a recommendation for a single vendor contractor that can do or provide the needed services or supplies. The PR should have additional documentation that supports it. So we should have some sort of scope of work, a performance work statement, some sort of description of supply with delivery times. And again, when we're talking about those supply items, those salient characteristics. And I'll probably say that word a few more times because keeping that in the back of our mind, it's really critical as to proving and justifying that a sole source is viable. All right, so again, the purchase order is going to have some sort of work description of that need. They should have conducted market research. Again, this is performed by the individual that pulled the PR together or someone within that agency department to support their independent government estimate. And they might have a sole source saying, hey, we did all of our market research and here's our statement of work. And we've made a determination that only one sole source, one company can provide that. And they're going to provide a sole source recommendation narrative. Now, sometimes if they've been working with that industry or with that particular business to kind of develop that need, to find that costing, which is really commonplace in that contracting activity on that business side where they're reaching out to industry, because they're trying to say, okay, what's the cost? What are the new options? Especially if they're moving into new technology, new equipment, new practices that weren't available, 5 or 10 years ago when original contracts were put in place. So they're working with industry. Industry provides that quote, and they write up something provided part of the purchase request, and all of that goes through to the contracting office. And the contracting officer, the KO, conducts market research to just determine, is this a viable sole source request? So again, there has to be some language provided by the requisitioner that helps determine whether it's a sole source. So then the KO makes that determination, yes, this is reasonable, or no, I think there are multiple sources and we're going to go out and make this a competitive activity. Now, part of this making that determination, there may be a requirement within the agency, and again, this can change from agency to agency. They might need to submit their review, their determination, if needed, to either legal or a small business professional or even a supervisory contracting officer before they move forward. So again, my experience at FAA, every single sole source, no matter how simple or how complex, had to go through a legal review, and that attorney would then make a determination of the risk for protest, and if it was truly, were there other sources, did it meet the definition of the FAR for that sole source option. Then based on that review, the KO makes a determination to either move forward with the sole source or issue as a competitive solicitation. So again, I'm kind of bringing up this process to keep in mind that there are these things behind the scene that happen that go through before a sole source is realized. So we're going to take this information, we're going to tie it in again when we start talking about developing sole source opportunities as a business development program. But keep in mind that having that sole source recommendation as part of that purchase requisition strengthens that viability for the sole source to actually move forward and for it not to be flipped on its head as a competitive action. Okay, so number 6, the solicitation is prepared, proposals received. If a sole source, when the contracting officer may sit, if this is a sole source, then the contracting officer may sit down with the potential contractor and discuss performance, ask for cost validation documents to determine price reasonable, and awards issued. So outside of a competitive action where an agency may, and you'll see the language within a solicitation, the government may or may not choose to enter into discussions with, and I don't remember the exact language, but they choose to enter into discussions so that they can do clarifications. You might see in complex solicitations in a competitive action where they remove the first batch and get it down to just a few that's going to be moving forward in that competitive manner, and they have an opportunity to provide their best and final. But those opportunities that to sit down and have a discussion are very defined and very limited what the contracting officers can ask. And again, the FAR has that information in that process if you look at the negotiated solicitation activity. Excuse me for one second. Sorry about that. All right, so, but when we talk about sit down, if there's just that one-to-one relationship, and this is just prior to award, then the contracting officer still has to write that price justification for award, that J&A, and they may sit down and say, okay, open your books. We want to see what is your overhead, what is your G&A, what profit margin are you adding to that award? And under that sole source, that is allowable because again, that responsibility for the contracting officer, they have to be able to provide that justification prior to even going the sole source award and then looking down, looking at that for their J&A. So as it says here, seems straightforward, but let's delve more into the justification documents that are needed to support award decision. And I pulled these in quote from a document, and I'll make sure that that is sent out to you with the slides that by Kristen Thomas. It was an NCMA magazine on lessons from sole source front lines, and I love these quotes. I put them in full. A sole source contract is awarded without full and open competition when only one responsible source can meet the needs. Okay, we've been talking about that. But while competition standards typically require agencies to select multiple bids to ensure best value, sole source awards must be instead justified through rigorous documentation. Contracting officers are required to demonstrate why competition is not feasible and how proposed price is fair and reasonable. And the only way they can come up with that, why the proposed price is fair and reasonable, often is they're going to sit down and review. Depending on the complexity of the solicitation and the requirement, they may even ask DCAA to do an audit of the books, or even DCMA to come in and do an audit of the management process to make sure that this is going to be flowing correctly. So part of that, and as a business entering into this opportunity, don't be surprised if you're asking to open your books and to provide a cost estimate breakdown so that they can further determine price reasonableness. Okay, this is more from that document, again, referenced here. In these cases, the contracting officer is responsible for determining that the award meets standard of fairness and reasonableness despite the absence of competition. So competition really in of itself is that justification, but sole source, we have to dig deeper. This includes evaluating technical necessity, validating cost and pricing data, ensuring the scope does not exceed the approved justification. So for contractors, this means proposals must withstand a heightened scrutiny and clearly articulate both the uniqueness of the solution and the rationale behind every major assumption. So she goes forward to saying, so sole source removes pressure of head-to-head competition, but they replace the pressures with heightened accountability and transparency. And without competing proposals to establish a market baseline, every assumption, estimate, and technical decision must stand on its own merits. So this is incredible information. It's a short document. I've posted a lot of it here. Like I said, I'll make sure that I get that all to you. And you should take an opportunity and read it. Because if we're talking about these heightened scrutiny and every assumption, estimate, technical must stand on its own merit. This is fabulous advice, even if we are pulling together that solicitation in a competitive market. So cost and pricing. So pricing integrity is everything in sole source contracting. Under the truthful cost or principle or pricing data statute, formerly known as TINA, that Truth in Negotiations Act, the burden of proof rests squarely on the contracting shoulders. And again, it talks about agency such as Defense Contract Management Agency and Defense Contract Audit Agency, DCMA, DCAA, as well as contracting officers will scrutinize your data, quote, and rationale. And if you have subcontractors, that can even roll down where they want the subcontractors for that activity to open their books as well, so they can determine that price fairness. All right, so when we talk about that sole source justification, I just want to kind of do a contrast. So again, we're thinking that need is unusual or compelling. Again, time, urgency, national security, and again, there was those lists that we saw in that FAR part 6 that went over the when we can go other than full and open competition. So when we're looking at products, we're looking at manufacturing restriction, brand name or equal, specific salient characteristics, again, tied back to that brand name or equal, performance specification, plugs into existing infrastructure, warranty limitations, authorized technicians, integrates with existing technologies or systems such as computer hardware, and specialized training already in place for staff, or we even might run into patent or intellectual property limitations. Just as an example, when it talks about performance specification, I remember we were doing, there was a request, this is back from my FAA days, there was a specific request they wanted, and I don't remember which, like a Chevy pickup truck, because it had a really short, they were looking for the short bed, it had a short wheelbase, and it was going out in a remote location where the turnarounds on the road were so limited that they needed that transport capability, but they had to have something that can maneuver within that space limitation. So this is where that brand name equal, and they specifically called out why this particular pickup truck met with the functionality needed for the remote space. And so it listed it must be able to perform in these conditions and in these tight spaces. And and again, there was that FAR clause brand name or equal. So it's kind of interesting because of that performance need. We might see that with snow machines for remote communities up in the Arctic. All right, products, let me move on. So for services, we have unique industry experience with working knowledge, and there might be a limitation of those expertise available. There's so many with that type of experience needed for that complexity of that solicitation. We might have had some sort of derivative time as a follow-up or a bridge contract. Next phase of a project, and we kind of already talked about that. It might be new technologies or patented technology, and it could be something from an innovation program like SBIR or STTR, that's Small Business Innovative Research, where this innovative methodology technology is in that phase 2, moving into phase 3, where they have that commercialization of that product, and it's available for government procurement without any royalty fees or other requirements, since those governmental funds were involved in that development of that product. The government desire to hit agency contracting goals, and we kind of talked about that already, following contracting authority for legally directed awards. So that's the phrase we're looking at. And again, that 8A program, HUBZone, service disabled, WASB, or economically disadvantaged. And again, these all kind of fall under that internal approval, again, that contracting authority, internal approval, consideration of time, consideration of mission, and no time for competition. So while the FAR is saying, hey, that's not a valid excuse, there are times under the correct contracting authorities when that is viable. Nothing like the FAR, we're talking about the law, and that answer is always, well, it depends. And this is where that it depends falls into place. So let's talk a little bit more about this as a business development strategy. All right, so now we're going to we talked about it from what does the FAR have to say about it? What do the contracting officers have to do to be able to have an end result that is a sole source? And what about for those of us in the industry that are looking for those sole source opportunities? So again, one of the best venues is through that small business certification, because as we had shown and even listed here a couple screens ago, these 4 programs, and for the VA, we also have the veteran-owned small business for directed awards. So having those small business certifications are a viable aspect for obtaining those sole source awards. But the contracting officer needs to know about your business and know that your business has these certifications, has that venue under which a sole source could be operated. And not only do you have the certifications, but that your business also has the capacity and the ability to perform said work. You have the financial wherewithal, you have the employees, you have the past performance, you have the business relationships to bring in subcontracting where necessary, or relationships such as a joint venture, the mentor protege program, but your business is strategically set to be able to meet those needs. And there's that opportunity through those small business certifications. If you're more, the one we're most familiar with is through the 8A program, where that opportunity source kind of goes through SBA's approval through the business opportunity specialist, and they kind of take a look at and approve yes or no whether this business is eligible, again, capacity and ability to perform that work, and kind of blesses, signs off on the approval of that sole source award. So thinking along that line, we often forget that that process is available under the other programs. And I'm not going to go into that, it's kind of a workshop on its own, but if you look into the FAR Part 19, where all of those defined under each of those subsets for the programs, they do give the description of when a sole source is viable under that set aside. So when we're then reaching out, because again, market your certification, and build those relationships with the agency and build off your past performance. And all of that kind of ties into, we want to develop a narrative that supports sole source activities, ensuring that every assumption, estimate, and technical decision stands on its own merit. And if those words sound familiar, that's because I had them in full just a few slides ago based from this article. But it brings up a good point. You need to be able to support. And often when we have our business development team or project managers that have that responsibility, and they're reaching out to the program side of the house to build their brand name awareness, to build those relationships, conversations happen. And there is an assumption that because that relationship was built, that that sole source is much more likely. But part of that responsibility for you all as the business is to make sure that you're providing enough documentation and helping develop that sole source narrative as to why this is the route it should go. The examples that I want to bring up, I was working with a company, and this is many years ago, and they were a distributor for a pre-made metal, uh, not just sheds, but full facilities. And this was going, they needed this facility to go out into a very remote location that had extreme weather conditions, high winds, heavy snow loads, extreme temperatures. It was going to house critical equipment and personnel. So there was a lot of uniqueness to this thing that needed to be built, and it needed to be more modular because, again, remote location. So the vendor had a great solution, and the manufacturer even stepped in on behalf, working with the vendor, working with the agency to develop full specifications that met all of those critical components: extreme weather, remote, wind loads, snow loads, etc. And they worked on it for well over a month. And they pulled together this application. It was a beautiful packet. There was the manufacturer had their own in-house engineering that provided the time. Of course, the business was working and they were working with the manufacturing agency. And there were a lot of man hours that went into developing this. And that beautiful package was put together. It had the quote from the manufacturer, working through that licensed distributor. It had the specifications for the documentation that had been built on that need. And this lovely purchase request went to contracting, and contracting said, this isn't a sole source activity. Anybody can make, there's multiple sources for that pre-manufactured building, and all of them can meet that ceiling characteristics. And it went out for a competitive bid. And ultimately, that company that had invested so much time and activity lost out on that award. And they weren't able to recoup all of that time and effort that was put into it from the front end. So that's kind of the horror story when we're talking about marketing your certification and when you're developing your narratives. Keep in mind that there is, if contracting is not involved in this discussion from the get-go, the odds of that moving into a competitive action can be really high, because it also depends which contracting officer that goes to, that has that experience with working with sole source, that can help make that decision under their own warrant, whether it's going to become a sole source or a competitive action. So again, be prepared to defend not only what, but why it's reasonable, necessary, and aligned with the government's stated requirements. So just be aware of, as we're building those relationships as part of our development strategy, that we don't give away too much without some sort of guarantee of sole source. Were there things they could have done differently to keep it within that sole source opportunity? I would say yes, they should have had the contracting officer involved sooner, and they should have had better justification and had some sort of that SWOT, that strength, weaknesses, opportunity, threat. Such an old term, but it's still a viable tool of why those other vendors couldn't provide to the same level. They really needed to support that sole justification. But again, building those relationships with the agencies, marketing your certification are all required. And just above all, relationships are the cornerstone of success in sole source environments. These programs often span years and evolve into close working partnerships, and credibility is earned through consistency, responsiveness, and honesty, even when the answers aren't convenient. Transparency about risks, schedule pressures, pricing rationale can turn difficult conversations into opportunities for collaboration. Phew, that was a lot. All right. I want to give you an example of sole source because there's also one of the things that I didn't mention when, as an agency for the contracting review process before a sole source is issued, unless it's outside of some of the set aside programs, it has to be posted for, and I believe it's like a 10-day, the FAR does have a time limit. And again, that might be adjusted by the agency guidance, where a sole source, the intent to award a sole source is posted in SAM, and it gives industry a chance to say, hey, wait a second, I can provide that same thing as well. So I have an example here, because often we look at that, oh, there's already an award and we just move on. But keep in mind, even if there's no way to break that particular sole source opportunity, if this sole source is something that you could have done, should timing have been better, opportunity, that relationship was already there, those other factors, this is something you can always follow up on as a future opportunity if not able to break this particular sole source. So keep in mind, this is what they look like. I found this by going into SAM, clicking at contracting opportunities, and I put in for the type of notice, special notices, and I had quite a list of sole source here, just even in the state of Alaska. So like this particular one, and you can see it comes out as a pre-solicitation. Often that opportunity type changes a lot, but from the very first description, this is a notice of intent to award a sole source contract and is not a request for competitive offers. And we can see in their call out that this action is being awarded on a sole source basis pursuant to FAR 12.102. And services required by the agency are available only from one responsible source, and no other type of service will satisfy agency requirement. So right here is the validation and justification that they're hanging their hat on. And it talks more about the base, U.S. Coast Guard base Kodiak. And again, this of intent is not a request. Interested organizations may submit their capability and qualifications to perform the effort in writing to the identified point of contact. And of course, this has a date. So this one is a little bit older, but it's a great example of there is an opportunity when you see a sole source to follow up with the contracting office. And even if this one, maybe there was a time contingency, or if they're talking about some sort of uniformity of supply, then it still is a great opportunity, because they're even saying, if you feel that you can do this effort, please contact us, provide your capabilities and qualifications to perform the effort in writing. So this gives you an opportunity to follow up for future need. All right, and I have the link here if anybody's curious, want to delve into that a little further. So when I had mentioned that the contracting officer has to write that justification and approval for other than full and open competition, I wanted to actually provide you an example, because if you are in that place here where you are working with the agency and it's looking like there is a good opportunity for that sole source, what does the contracting officer have to go through, and what type of language do they need to justify and approve that sole source award? So even in the case here with this ambulance, where they were buying the shell of an ambulance, and then it was going to be sent to Coast Guard, there was that justification that had to be done. Sometimes you might see that posted with the notification, but this is a little bit in addition to. But you can see, again, they have to check the rationale, only one responsible source, urgent, compelling, other, provide an explanation, and they have to support their market research of why they decided to do this. And in this particular one, you can see that they decided there were 3 vendors on GSA's multiple award schedule, and 2 of the vendors, if you view the terms, only separate in smaller, or only operate in smaller regions. So again, they were looking at a competitive but when they got into the details, only one could provide. So again, I'm just kind of providing that for your information and thought process if you are working with an agency and you're working towards that sole source opportunity, keep those requirements in mind. So one last topic here. I know I have it scheduled until 11:30, but I think we might get done a little earlier. But let's talk about single source versus sole source. Now, this isn't from the contract officer's perspective, it's more of an in-house internal. So we're talking about implementing internal buying decisions. So let's say that we have a cost reimbursement contract. And I'm not saying this is the only place where it might apply, but it definitely has the strongest need in that point in time. Under a cost reimbursement contract, the language in the FAR clause really talks about the contractor is making a best faith effort to control costs and keep the costs down so that they're, again, fair and reasonable to the contract activity. And so the risk is all on the government to make sure that they have the contractor that is taking advantage. And of course, there's an audit process in that end if you have all the different fees and goes through each year to determine your overhead rates and all that so that you get a true cost reimbursement. So part of that, in applying that is an internal practice. One, sure, cost reimbursement contracts, it makes a lot of sense to have these buying provisions in place as an internal policy. But for those of you that live and breathe government contracting, and that is the bulk of your competition, even, though you might have those commercial contracts, having your costs remain competitive is really going to give you that edge to your competitor. So when we're talking single sourcing, it looks at buyer chooses from multiple supplies and they've made a determination they're going to go with one. There's moderate negotiation power, there's a moderate risk. Alternatives do exist, but we've made a determination. There's some flexibility to switch and we have competitive pricing. Maybe we're going to build that relationship. Sole sourcing, again, only one supplier is available. The supplier has dominant power. Again, who gets to negotiate that? They're only one, they've got the upper hand. There's a high risk, there's no alternatives, there's not much flexibility, and there is possibility of a higher pricing. And just talking about, internet here in the state of Alaska, talk about higher pricing and who has the supplier has the dominant power. All right, so let's talk about this. Single sourcing is a strategic decision to use one supplier despite others being available, aiming for better pricing or partnership. And think of this as your supply chain logistics. You are building those relationships. So while sole sourcing is a non-competitive necessity where only one supplier exists in the market for a required good or service, single sourcer offers control, whereas sole sourcing carries higher risk, higher cost, and limited alternatives. We kind of talked about that. So when we're doing single sourcing, that strategic choice, you're choosing to buy from a single vendor, although others are available, to build strategic partnerships, achieve volume discounts, simplified logistics, or ensure consistent quality. So again, it's a long-term strategy dependent upon your business need, and you're building that relationship and you're building and strengthening that supply chain within your own company to be able to perform on those federal contracts. And flexibility, the company can switch suppliers if necessary. So again, sole sourcing, no alternatives, only one vendor able to supply. Maybe we have, again, patents or specialized technology. The item is proprietary, patented, or uniquely qualified, and there are no alternatives, giving the supplier a monopoly. And there's also those rare occasions where you are looking at a contract and the government calls out a mandated source for supply, and suddenly everybody, even though the solicitation itself is a competitive action, there is a component in there that has a mandated source, and that individual gets to control the pricing for that part of the contract. All right, so that internal purchasing plan. So part of it, and this is again where I use GPT, again, .com/Sammy to get from that government contracting overview applied. And I asked how to develop an internal purchasing plan for a cost reimbursement contract. And it gave me 10 really valid points. For purpose of time, I didn't copy all of those, but I did want to talk about the first. So when we're developing an internal purchase plan, excuse me one second. Sorry about that. A cost reimbursement contract flips the usual mindset. If you're not just buying efficiently, you're buying in a way that's defensible, auditable, and aligned with reimbursement rules. So building this as an internal buying strategy really makes sense if you are operating in a very competitive environment, and not just again for government contracts, but just for standard business practice. An internal purchasing plan is less about squeezing costs and more about controlling document and justifying it. So we're taking some of those processes that the contracting office have to do when they're looking at a sole source, and we're bringing that in-house and we're building our own in-house purchasing process. So here's how you build one that actually holds up to scrutiny. So you start with the contract role, not your preferences. So what is the contract saying? What are we looking at? And we're going to treat it that. So again, that cost reimbursement, we are under that gaze to provide, keep the costs as low as possible. So again, not necessarily what we prefer, but what is the contract requiring? Before planning anything, extract the key constraints from the contract. And this is where we kind of looking at from that FAR perspective, the allowable versus unallowable costs in FAR Part 31, approval thresholds. So if it gets over a certain dollar amount, do we need to go back to the agency? Procurement standards, competition requirements, small business goals, etc. And this is a good way to tie in too for those of you that have moved into a full and open competition outside of a set aside where now small business goals are required. So again, that it can be rolled into our internal procurement standards. And then those ceiling costs and ceiling estimated cost limits. Okay, so if you skip this step, your whole plan can look efficient, but gets closer, but still gets cost disallowed later. Item 2, we're going to define purchase categories and risk levels. Makes a lot of sense. Breaking into logical buckets. So direct materials, subcontracts, consultants, equipment, travel, indirect, those shared costs. And then you're going to assign a risk level. And the example they give, high, low, large dollar amount, complex or client sensitive, tighter controls, low risk, routine, low value, a simplified process. And this prevents over-engineering small purchases while keeping the big ones compliant. So this is, again, something we're building that effort ahead of time to incorporate into an internal buying process. So the build approval workflows that mirror the risk. Don't use a one-size-fits-all process. For example, if it is less than 5K, it can be a departmental purchase. If it's between 5 and 50,000, there might be a procurement or and maybe a finance review. If it's over 50,000, there might be an executive or client approval. If again, purchasing under a governmental contract or even a commercial contract where they really are looking at that cost control, and then tie this directly to the contract clause so the auditors can see the language. Now they're talking about in this case, so if DCAA is coming in and looking at your approved purchasing or looking to approve your purchasing plan for a specific cost reimbursement contract. Okay. I didn't, again, roll into, it went up to 10 items, and I was, for the purposes of time, I didn't go through all of it. If you are liking the way this is sounding, again, you can go here, that chatgpt.com. I just went directly to the website, and this is the question I asked. And you can see those full 10 steps that they had outlined. But this just kind of gives us a moment to look at streamlining our costs. One, cost of doing business is just incredibly high right now with all of the various components going on in that global scale. And when you're talking government contracting, you are in a very competitive market to be able to provide and maintain those costs, yet still have a profitable outcome for the performance of said contract. So does anyone have any questions of everything that we've talked about so far? Does anybody want to share any experiences that they've had with sole source? Having to open your books and negotiate and having the contracting officer say, nope, you can't have this number as an overhead. This is all we're letting you have. I have worked with clients not many times where they were looking at a sole source contract and all of their numbers were limited. And we had to actually bring in, we brought in the PCR and we actually brought in the SBA ombudsman to stand up on behalf of the contractor, because what the agency was trying to do just wasn't feasible, wasn't realistic to limit those costs in such a manner that they were. All right, well, this kind of brings me to the end of my presentation, and this is where I get to remind you all who we are, what we do. I recognize most everybody that's joined us today, so I won't go through in detail, but I just want to call out that our Alaska Apex is one of 96 others across the US, Puerto Rico, and Guam. And so if you are looking at expanding beyond the Alaska boundary, looking at expanding and diversifying your geographic locations, feel free to check out the Apex Accelerator in those places of performance. While we all focus on that federal contracting, each one of us is kind of experts in our own backyard, looking at those state and local activities. So feel free to reach out on the bottom two, the napex.us, that's our national association website that has a list of providers, or you can go directly to the Department of Defense Office of Small Business Program, and this bottom link is their website. Click on that link and you can look up all of the various contact information for the other Apex Accelerator offices. And last but not least, I threw a lot of information at you. You guys are relatively quiet. And so I'll be honest, if I'm not getting questions, my ego likes to assume that I've done such a great job. No questions were needed. But if you're like me and you come up with all the questions after the fact and you're like, why didn't I ask this, that, or the other? Feel free to reach out to us. Let us know how we can help you. If you're looking at a sole source opportunity or trying to develop that as a business development strategy, please let us know how we can assist you with that process. Well, we still have 20 minutes on the clock, so if anyone has any questions, thanks, Kelly, just let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to give you 20 minutes back of your time and call it an early lunch. I won't tell. I hope you all have a fantastic day, and I hope this information was useful to you. And again, I will get you the slides and the articles from which I pulled this. I'll get that emailed out to you this afternoon. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to officially close the webinar. Have a great rest of your day.